Frances Underhill. I work for the End of Life Partnership, which is a charitable organisation funded by the Clinical Commissioning Group, so NHS in Cheshire. And we do all sorts of different things. We train clinicians, so we have a group of educators that come and train all our GPs and people in the hospices and the hospitals, care home staff, to make sure that we have a really good standard of end-of-life care. And we also work alongside the public to be able to support people to think about planning for the future, planning their care. We support carers to kind of build the knowledge, skills and confidence around caring. And we also support other organisations such as buddies and befriending groups, churches. We've supported the police and the fire service, all sorts of different community groups that have any issues or wants further training around anything to do with caring or planning future care, end of life, or anything around palliative conditions as well. We also have a specialist dementia team who support people and their carers that have advancing dementia. And they offer a consultancy service to help and support those carers around understanding how to support the person they're caring for with the particular dementia that they have. Trying to think if there's anything. We're also running a carers wellbeing programme, so that will be coming up. So if any of you are working with carers and you feel that they need a little bit more knowledge, or perhaps they need some advice and support, then we are going to be running those, and I can give that to Kendra at the end to be able to email out to you. I'm also going to share the presentation with you as well, so you will get the full presentation as well sent over to you at the end. I'm going to try and share my screen.
You should be host now, Frances, so it should be all good to go.
So
I'll send an email out to everybody afterwards with a bit of a feedback for you all, and also any information that Frances has shared with us, a PowerPoint and things as well.
Okay. So can everybody see that?
Okay. Yeah, looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you're all here to gain some further understanding about how to support someone who's experiencing loss, grief and bereavement. Is that right? That's what I'm here for anyway.
Yes, that's right, yes.
So quite a few people feel uncomfortable dealing with the idea of supporting someone with loss, who's had a loss or they're grieving, because sometimes it makes us feel quite powerless, because it's something that we can't actually stop happening. We can't kind of stop somebody from dying or having those feelings of loss when somebody does die. And it's also quite difficult as well if you've just met the person. It's equally difficult if you have also just, or you're not able to support that person face to face, and you have to do that maybe virtually or over the telephone, because it is quite different than seeing somebody. So tonight we're going to kind of learn about what loss, bereavement, grief and mourning is, and develop your understanding of that. I'm also going to run through some tips on how you can help, even if your contact is indirect. So we're going to talk about how you can support someone over the telephone, and also to build your confidence as well, because grief and loss is a perfectly normal experience. And you know, we all will go through that at some point in our lives, and it's important to recognise that this session is quite emotive, so I do want you to look after yourself. If you feel that actually, you know, something's hitting home or you need a minute, please do just, you know, go and take a breath of fresh air, go and get a drink of water. I know that a lot of people are under pressure at the moment, and sometimes if you don't feel that you're the right person to support, if you are supporting someone who's gone through a loss, it's okay to say, actually, I can't support this person at this time, because you also have to look after yourselves, because if you are going through something as well in your life, it can aggravate that, and it can make that seem more pronounced, should I say. Okay.
Frances, can I just interrupt you before we go on? One of our attendees is just trying to join, and as I've given you, are you able to let her in? Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Should be Lynn, I think.
Lovely.
Thank you, Frances. Sorry about that.
Fine, yeah. So with the recent lockdown, people have been feeling quite lonely and isolated, particularly carers, and particularly those people who have had a bereavement. It can be quite a lonely time anyway, and having someone there such as a buddy to support that person really help to just take the weight off our shoulders. We do know that actually the recent social isolation has contributed to some of that loneliness, and we do know that because people have been bereaved over the lockdown period, that's had a detrimental effect on some of their emotional and physical health as well. And so knowing when to get somebody to the GP, we're going to talk about when to get somebody to the GP if they're displaying kind of some emotional and physical symptoms that actually need to be supported via the health service. A lot of bereaved people have been having to stay by themselves, possibly in the same house as the person that they shared that had died, and that can be quite kind of lonely, but also heightens the loss that they're going through, and they can have heightened feelings, and it can feel more intense at this time, and sometimes that can overwhelm people because we can't get out and about at the moment. They may need that little bit of extra support. So just before we start, I just want to kind of really just clarify what we mean by supporting somebody. When we empathise with somebody, it means we kind of know what they're going through. Perhaps we've been through something similar ourselves, but actually we're not walking that journey with them. We didn't know that person particularly well. They weren't perhaps a family member, particularly as a buddy. And that's when we kind of emphasise, and emphasising is a much better way of being able to support someone who has had a loss, because if we sympathise, and by sympathise I mean you know, we walk through that bereavement with them. Perhaps we've known the person and we're feeling some of the feelings that they're feeling about that person. We might feel sad, you know, sad and upset, and you know, have those memories of that person, and that's sympathizing. And sometimes you know, we all sympathise with people, but if you're supporting somebody through a bereavement, it's much better if you can empathise with them rather than sympathise with them, because if we sympathise with them, sometimes our own feelings take over, And then we're not focusing on being able to support that individual or that family as perhaps we would do if we weren't so close. Okay, just to clarify what we mean by loss, a loss is something that goes missing from our life or changes. It's more of a change, really, and there can be lots of different changes. It can be divorce, it can be moving house, it can be financial loss, it can be the loss of a loved one or a pet. There's all sorts of different types of loss. And some people will have multiple losses, and that's important to mention, because although they might be missing the person, they might also have lost their home, or they might have lost some financial support. So there can be other losses and underlying losses that people can worry about as well. Bereavement is really what we experience. So it's the kind of time frame for us to be able to adjust to the change, to the change of the loss that we've had, to living without whatever it was that we've lost. Grief is what we feel, and how we feel, how we behave through that loss, and how we show that to the outside world. And mourning is a lot of the rituals that we have around bereavement. We might have, a funeral. In the olden days, people would lay their loved ones out in the front room, wear black clothes, and that's just telling, the wider community that person has lost another person, basically. So that's what we mean by mourning. Okay, so for us to be able to understand a little bit more about loss and grief, we're going to have a look at some of the theoretical frameworks. And the reason we do this is just so that we can see how best to support people with their loss, and maybe where they are in terms of their feelings and thoughts. They also describe what happens when someone suffers a loss, and also it can explain why individuals experience the things that they do. And what it's really important to think about is, when we have a look at some of these theories and some of the thoughts and feelings, is that most of them, well, actually all of them, are fairly normal. And that's really important, because sometimes you will have somebody you may be supporting who will say, oh, I don't know why I'm still feeling like this. I'm not quite sure. And you'll be able to have that opportunity then to support them and say, well, you're still feeling like this because, and there will be a reason there for that. And you will see that reason because it will relate back to some of these theories. Okay. I am going to skip through them, but again, you are going to get this presentation at the end. So there's quite a few different theories out there. These are some of the more well-known ones. A lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross made a grief cycle, and this was really based around the person that was dying and what they felt about kind of the end of their life. But then she realised that actually it was also kind of a cycle for those that were supporting and looking after and caring for the person that was facing end of life. And she felt that people would often start off with denial, maybe when somebody's told, there's no further treatment, or has a diagnosis of a palliative condition or an illness, people can go into denial. And she felt that, that might represent itself as shock, or people might be fearful of what the future holds. And really it's thinking about, what does the future hold, and in the unknown, really. So it's thinking about that. She then felt that people would then kind of tip over the edge and start feeling a little bit frustrated, anxious, irritated, because, you know, they feel out of control, basically. And she felt that many people then would kind of drop into depression and feel quite overwhelmed and helpless, and you know, sometimes withdrawn. And then eventually people start to bargain with the idea. They might struggle to find meaning, they might reach out to others, they might want to think about making a will, they might want to write some letters to loved ones, they might want to tell their life story or write things down. And then eventually coming to acceptance, exploring options, you know, putting a new plan in place, and for those people that are left behind and are grieving, how can they adapt to and accept that the person will no longer be with them? So that's how Kubler-Ross felt that people went through bereavement. A more modern idea is the whirlpool of grief, and this resonates with quite a lot of people. And it's the idea that everybody's on a journey down the river of life, and when we lose something, no matter what it is, we kind of are thrown over the edge of the waterfall, and we end up in this whirlpool of grief, and we go through all different kinds of emotions. We might feel quite disorganized, we might feel that we can't cope. Sometimes some people get stuck on the rocks, and by that we mean that they have to sometimes put their grief and bereavement to one side, because actually, because of the loss, they've suffered a health, you know, their health has suffered, and sometimes they have to address their health needs first before they can go back into the whirlpool to address all their feelings of grief. Some people end up all washed up, and people might say, use the words emotional breakdown, or need you know, professional help and support, and eventually they'll get that support and end up back into that whirlpool, dealing with all those different feelings. And eventually, for most people, they will then begin a new journey, and they will come to the realization that that person isn't there, and they start to reorder. So people start to reorder their life and move then down on their new journey, down a new river, and so on. And that's how some people feel that grief kind of manifests itself. Now, I've had quite a few bereavements. I think my most recent one was about 3 years ago, and this is how my experience was. So I don't know if this would resonate with you, but I'd gone from shock to hope to emotional outbursts to feeling that I had to keep going and do everything for everybody else, and you know, show no emotion, to feelings of, you know, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I also felt a bit of depression, loneliness, numb, and it was all a big jumble. So my experience didn't really fit with any of the theories. All these different experiences, whether it's the Kubler-Ross, whether it's the whirlpool, or whether it's my own experience, they're all going to be very different, because everybody is on their own journey. Everybody will deal with bereavement and loss in a very different way, and that's okay. And nobody should be made to feel that they need to be dealing with that loss the same way as perhaps you would, or maybe I would, because it's so personal. And there are reasons to this, which I'll go through in a minute. What William Worden felt was that there were tasks to mourning, and however you're going to feel and whatever your experience is, there are some tasks that we all have to go through, whether we kind of like it or not really. And the first is to accept the reality of the loss, and that it's happened and we can't change that. The second is to work through the pain of grief, because unfortunately it is painful, and we all want to make it better sometimes, but actually we do need to work through the pain of grief for us to be able to accept and move forward with our own lives. The third task is to adjust to an environment which the deceased person is missing. And that might be very different, and people will need a lot more time to do that than perhaps task 1 and 2. And the final task is to find a connection with that person whilst moving forward. And by this, I mean, how can we keep that person within our thoughts, within our routines? What things can we do to keep that person part of us, because they have been part of us? And these are the 4 tasks that William Worden feels that whatever we're going through, whatever we're feeling on that day, because people who are bereaved will have days where they feel up and down, and sometimes throughout the day we can feel very, I can cope and I'm okay in the morning, and then it gets to afternoon, evening, and it can be a bit more, it can feel a bit more lonely, that actually then we feel much more of our grief coming through. And it might be that when you're supporting somebody, that actually they might appreciate a telephone call in the evening, because that might be the time when they're feeling the most lonely. And so sometimes when you're supporting people, it's thinking about asking those questions of when's a good time to support you. They probably won't know, but you can say to them, well, when do you feel most lonely? When do you feel your grief the most? Because that's often a good time for you to be able to contact them and for them to be able to share some of that pain of grief. Okay.
Frances, I'm aware that you're talking quite a lot and there's a lot of information to go through. Do you want to open to any questions, or would you like to leave that till the end?
That's fine. Does anybody have any questions?
I think there's quite a lot to take in there, and what really resonated with me was that last slide where you talked about relocating that person within your life and how you keep those memories alive. I never really thought about, you said, to emotionally relocate them and move on with life. That's and
it can feel like that sometimes. Somebody who I supported a little while ago, they kind of said that the person hasn't really gone, they're still here, they've just kind of shifted, and that's how they felt it, the person, the person was, they'd kind of shifted, and they still talk to that person. These kind of things help. If somebody wants to talk to their loved one, don't discourage it, because that's their way of kind of relocating that person, and it's helping them to move forward. The other thing is that grief can often awaken some, quite strong emotions of other losses that we've had as well. And that can be quite true for if you're looking after somebody, if you're supporting somebody. It might be a similar situation to what you've found yourself in before. and sometimes you might need to take a step back, as I said before, and look after yourself, because sometimes what somebody else is going through can you know, bring back some emotions for you as well. And then you find yourself not able to emphasize because you're kind of sympathizing with them, and you need to kind of keep the balance between supporting them and making sure that you know what they're going through. So
it's so difficult. I mean, we were having a bit of a chat before we started the session about, you know, the work that the buddies do and how you get to know people and they become friends as well. And you know, it's dealing with some of that and the things that their buddies are going through, but also if one of those buddies does pass away as well, it's so hard because you've got all your stuff going on as well. But I think absolutely everybody is different, and I always remember somebody saying to me about how it kind of comes in waves, which I think is a really good way of describing it, because you, like you say, you can be okay in the morning, but then it's something happens in the evening, or it just kind of comes in waves sometimes.
It does, and sometimes it can come, you know, there isn't any end to loss and grief and bereavement, really, because, as you say, sometimes it could be something that a song or a smell or you know, visiting somewhere, and it sparks a memory of the person, and you almost kind of have a wave of grief going through you at that point, and that can be years later. I remember I was with I'd gone about a year ago, not this Mother's Day but the Mother's Day before, and I'd gone shopping, and I was lots of mums and daughters, and my mum died about nearly 6 years ago, but for some reason I just seemed to notice all these mothers and daughters doing their shopping, and I thought, I can't do that. And it got me quite emotional, and you know, that kind of wave of grief or veil of grief came over me. Does anybody else ever feel like that? Yeah.
I heard someone saying yes there, definitely. Don't forget to unmute yourselves if you wanted to, but yeah, I'm sure people do.
Yeah. And I think really, you know, when you're looking at supporting people, it's thinking about, you know, have they started to accept the reality of loss? You know, are they at this first stage, or perhaps they're kind of down here at task 3 of adjusting to the environment? So they haven't, you know, they've worked through some of the sadness, and you may kind of be, you know, befriending them at a point where actually they're wanting to start to do things for themselves. So it's worth thinking about what kind of stage are those people at, and how am I best to support them.
Frances,
Frances,
could you say something, because it, you know, all of those sort of frameworks, theories sound quite logical, and you know, people are progressing through them, and so my experience is that you sometimes come across people who seem stuck, you know, in one of those early stages and just don't seem to be able to move forward. You know, just on your previous slide, you know, that very first one about accepting the reality, and you know, I've certainly, you know, tried to support people who seem to, you know, even, you know, just really struggle getting past that very first stage, and still, you know, just kept going round in circles between sort of denial and anger, and you know, and couldn't find their way then through, you know, never got or seemed to get to those further stages. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that what we've done with people who get kind of, like you say, get stuck in a particular kind of emotion or thought process, and one of the things that I know that a lot of the counsellors do is they ask the person to write it down, and to write everything that they can possibly think of that is bothering them about the way the person, you know, maybe died, or what it is that, you know, that person did. And sometimes they've written a list as well, so they've done things like you know, what did your husband do, what were the things, what jobs did they do in the house, and just something so simple as writing a list of what jobs that person did, or how that person made them feel, or writing about that person can help them to kind of put their feelings about it on, you know, and park them on a piece of paper, and they find that really helps them to kind of put it to one side and to start to open up a little bit, because usually somebody gets stuck in one particular phase because they can't accept that phase, really. So it's not that they're not accepting that the person's lost, they're in a kind of denial phase, but they're stuck feeling that they've got to be at that denial stage. I know that sounds a little bit complicated. It'll make a little bit more sense as I show you a few more slides. This is just the way that people grieve, and it depends very much on the attachment they had to that person, the quality and length of the relationship. It can be the length and nature of the illness and the actual nature of the person's end of life. And then also it can be the social acceptance, which tends to mean it sometimes there are still, unfortunately, a lot of deaths that are still quite taboo subjects to talk about. One is people find it difficult to kind of acknowledge and to talk about a miscarriage, for example, or a stillbirth, or even a suicide. So there are, or a murder, you know, there's still quite a few different types of deaths that people find very difficult to talk about, because society doesn't tend to talk about it too much, because it, you know, doesn't happen to everybody. And it's quite a minority kind of group of people as well. And the degree of attachment is quite important, because that usually has an effect on how the person will move through their bereavement and grief. And what tends to happen if somebody gets stuck in their grief is because they have a almost like unfinished business. So there's something that is preventing them from moving on, and it's usually something to do with the relationship that they'd had, or one of these. So it could be that it could have been the length and nature of the illness, how the person died, the person, what the relationship was like, and how much that person felt attached to them. And usually one of those things will, people will find themselves stuck at a particular point, and it kind of leads back to one of these 5 different things, really. If people do get stuck, what we tend to say is kind of talk to them about how they're feeling. How do they feel that they're coping? Because often people will say, oh, how are you doing today? And people be like, oh yes, I'm okay, or yeah, I'm a bit up and down, and things like that. And actually sometimes they need to be told that, well, actually I'm not sure you are okay today because, and you know, say maybe it's because you look tired, so you might say what you see. And sometimes that's a better way of almost helping that person to acknowledge that they're stuck in that kind of phase, because they're too busy grieving. They can't see where they are. They can't see what the problem is with, you know, going over and over and over the maybe the end of life and what happened and this happened and, you know, I can't believe it, and, you know, it shouldn't have happened. And if somebody's kind of stuck at that level, it's kind of saying to them, you know, we've talked about this quite a lot. You've mentioned it the last 3 times we've been, and you've not really talked about anything else. And sometimes it can be that kind of realization, because they're stuck in the moment and they're doing all the feeling. Sometimes they can get stuck in a moment because of the feelings and the behaviors overtake, and they need somebody to say to them, actually, you know, you've been crying for quite a few weeks now. Is that something that I can help you with? Is that something that you would like me to help with? And they might not even have realised that every time you go round that they're crying, because they're living through that. And sometimes that's the reason that they get stuck as well. So sometimes just acknowledging to them what you're actually seeing when you go and speak to them or talk to them, it can give them the sense of, oh, somebody's noticed I'm sad, somebody's noticed I'm angry. And sometimes that's all they'll need. They'll just need that acknowledgement that you've noticed, and that the support is there. So that, I don't know whether that kind of answers your question, but those are kind of some of the things that I would be thinking of, you know, supporting and thinking about when I would be befriending. I'm going to just run through these very quickly, because they're all feelings that, you know, you have through grief. So these are some of the feelings that people will feel through grief, and all of these are completely normal. Some people will feel angry, others will feel fearful, some might be quite bitter, some people you may find are quite numb, and all these different feelings are completely normal. If any of these feelings are going on for a lengthy period of time, so I'm talking about 3 months plus. So if somebody is still quite fearful, maybe about leaving the house or what's going to happen in the future, then we would always say try to encourage them to go to the GP to talk about that fear, because there might be more to it. And it might be something that the GP feels needs to be addressed via a trained counsellor. So that's the different feelings that people have. Thoughts, all sorts of different thoughts. These are all completely normal. Again, some people will have hallucinations, and that can be quite scary when you're supporting somebody. Also suicidal thoughts. If somebody is having suicidal thoughts, again, some of these feelings are completely normal. But if somebody is displaying some of these thoughts and telling you about them, and that's going on for you know, quite some time, then that, again, you would need to, particularly around things like hallucinations and suicidal ideas, those are the 2 main ones that would need addressing by the GP. But they are normal, and people do have hallucinations. They've seen their loved ones. You know, some people feel that they can't continue without that person in their life. And these are all completely normal thoughts. So although we might think, oh gosh, that's a strange thing to, you know, to be thinking about, actually it's just their way of experiencing their loss. Does anybody have any questions?
No questions.
No. Okay. So these are some of the behaviours, and I want you to kind of have a really good look at some of these, because these are things that you may see, and you may want to write a little bit of a diary about this as well, because some behaviours, all these behaviours are normal again. So some people can act quite strange, some people might have strange dreams, things like appetite and sleep obviously change, and all these are completely normal again, but it's always useful to ask those questions. So when you are going to support someone, it's noticing, you know, are they crying? Are they still crying, you know, 3 weeks later? You know, asking them, you know, are you getting enough sleep? Appetite, how are you eating? Some of these things. Asking, you know, have you been having any dreams? Maybe that's why you're not sleeping. Opening up that conversation to talk about the way that they're behaving, because they might be behaving in that way because you know, it might be completely normal for them, and that's fine. Oops. But again, it's worth writing some of these things down, and it's kind of, when you're doing a little diary of somebody, particularly if you're supporting somebody who's through bereavement, it's often useful to write down some of the things, because we tend to forget, and we tend to get caught up in the moment, and we don't often notice some of these things. But all these behaviours, if they continue over time, again, they can become, you know, problematic, particularly things like sleep and appetite, and also as well things like avoidance as well, because they're not working through their pain. So some of those things may then need to be addressed by the GP. And then again, with physical symptoms, again, it's thinking about, how could I ask the question how they are physically? You know, you could say, are you feeling well in yourself today? You know, or they might mention, oh, I've got a bit of a headache or something. And it's worth noting, because then if that person continues to feel any of these, they may need to go to the GP because of the physical health problem. And these particular ones are quite normal reactions to grief and bereavement. Particularly heart palpitations, which often is due to anxiety. So it brings on sweating and heart palpitations. So you may want to kind of note some of those things down as well, and ask how they're feeling physically, so that you can, you know, support them to maybe visit their GP or get some advice from the pharmacist. Has anybody experienced anyone who's had any physical symptoms when they've supported someone?
I was actually just discussing with a friend of mine the other day. We had someone that he worked with who has taken their own life, and he said to me that he's been suffering of heart palpitations, and he says it's just kind of come on at the weekend after he found out about his work colleague. So very much could be related to that, because it's obviously been a very, you know, quite a big shock. And what you were saying about certain types of death are sometimes a little bit more taboo, or people don't like to talk about them particularly. I mean, it's hard enough losing somebody, but when it's something like suicide, it can leave people with so many questions about what's happened and what they might have been able to do differently, or why, you know. Yeah, so definitely.
I'd also like to chip in there, if I may. The topic of suicide. Somebody close to me committed suicide, leaving two boys of 8 and 10 and his wife. Now the boys are quite angry. They are being helped by child and adolescent mental health services, but I wondered if you had any different techniques for helping children overcome loss, because it must be even harder for them to suddenly understand that their father's not coming home ever.
Yeah, it can be quite difficult. What I would suggest you do is have a look on there's an organisation called Child Bereavement UK. So I don't know if you want to write that down.
I am, yes.
Child Bereavement UK, it is a fantastic website, and they have all sorts of different things. They have workbooks and things like that for children, but they also have advice and support, perhaps if they're struggling or finding things difficult at school. They have support booklets for the school to be able to work through with them, and you know, for the staff to have an understanding what they're going through as well.
Yes.
And also as well, they I'm trying to think what else they have. They also have some books as well, which talk about things like suicide. They talk about things like cancer, dementia, Parkinson's, if somebody's been killed in a road accident. So they have almost like social stories that, you know, will talk through how other children are feeling. And sometimes, particularly with children, if you're reading them a story that relates to what they're going through, they relate that much better than you just telling them. Sometimes children need words and pictures and a story to understand what's happened. And if it's happened to, say, Tommy and Jack, you know, oh, that happened to Tommy and Jack, and it's happened to me, and you know, sometimes then they can put themselves in the story and deal with their emotions that way.
Thank you. I'll look that up. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to skip over that one and talk about offering support. These are just some of the things to remember. So it's remembering that when you're supporting someone, it's their experience, not yours. Obviously, if you're a buddy, I would expect that you've got a lot of patience, and you know, you would start where the person's at. So that's, you know, not telling you to suck eggs or anything. Don't think you have to provide or give all the answers. A lot of people will say things like, oh, you know, it's okay, you know, don't cry, because actually we want to try and make it better, when actually sometimes we can't, and it's good for them to cry, because it's releasing those emotions. It's allowing them to control the conversation. If they want to talk about it, let them talk about it. But actually, sometimes people need a break, and by talking about something else, it's giving them permission to have a break from grieving, because it can be quite tiring and, you know, wear people down. When actually, you know, talking about something else can just give them that time they need to, or their brains to kind of process how they've been feeling in a different way. Asking them how they're coping. We've talked about that already. People have different ways of coping. So sometimes you will find, you know, you'll need to be supportive in different ways for different people. Obviously, letting your genuine concern and caring show, and allowing them to express as much unhappiness as they're feeling. So if they do want to have a cry, let them have a cry, get the tissues out. You know, sometimes just being there it is all that they need. So sometimes you don't need to talk. Sometimes you just need sit and listen. And that can be quite hard, because most people, I don't know about you, but me anyway, I don't like awkward silences. And sometimes it can feel quite awkward, especially when you're kind of there in the capacity of trying to support them. And encourage them to be patient with themselves. There's no rule that says, okay, you've got to be back at work doing this, that and the other, and not thinking about the person who's died ever again. You know, it's done now, that's it. Some people will be like that, but it's reminding them to take their time, because sometimes people do feel that they've got to be doing, and that again then wears them out. Okay, so these are just a couple of things that can be said in a different way, because I think sometimes we need to watch the way that we're saying things. There isn't really anything wrong. There isn't really a wrong way to say anything when we're supporting, but sometimes if we think about it, we could say them in a slightly different way that would mean, you know, may not take offence. So things like, I know how you're feeling. Well, actually, you haven't got an idea how they're feeling, because it's their feelings. But saying that you're there to listen, you know, or talk, whatever they want to do. It's time you should be moving on. I can hear that you're still feeling the loss, but would like to support you if I can. And that's one of the bases I like to think of when I'm supporting someone. I like to say, you know, I'm there to support that person. What can I see? What are they doing? What are they doing? How are they feeling? What behaviours are they? And I just say what I see, because sometimes that's a better way of doing it. Sometimes you need to focus on other things. It must be very hard, but I'm here if there's anything you would like to talk through. So these are just some simple things, is really just to remind you to think about the language that you're using around people, because sometimes people do take offence, but again, it's not personal, it's just the way that they're feeling about the loss. And some people will be angry. You might get people that are angry with you, but it is, again, sometimes it's just the way they're feeling, and it's not personally directed at you as well. These are just a couple of things to avoid. Not letting yourself feel that you can't do it, because everybody can do it, everybody can support, everyone can, you know, talk to somebody. I think, you know, most people who are buddies have got, you know, enough confidence to be able to talk to someone. Don't change the subject, even if the person's getting upset. Let them, you know, lead the conversation. Unlike me, don't talk too much, try to listen. And then don't give, you know, try to give advice or tell them what they should be doing, and avoiding cliches, time is a great healer. Or we had a care worker who told, there was a lady who had twins, and one of the twins had died, and she said, oh, well, you know, you've got your other twin, he needs you. Yes, that's fine. Yes, the yours has got another twin, but let's just not forget the one that died. It's not gone away. And, you know, that caused quite a lot of upset. Don't change the subject when they mention their loss, and don't avoid mentioning their loss out of fear of reminding them of the pain. And that's particularly poignant as you try, you know, somebody's maybe had a bereavement 12 months ago. Mention it, talk to them about it. It's, you know, it helps them with their process. And then these are just a few things that maybe you would like to ask over the telephone, because we find it quite difficult because we can't pick up on people's behaviours and cues. So we do need to ask them the questions directly. So asking them questions like, are they managing to eat healthily? Maybe, you know, are they keeping active? What's their sleep like? How are they looking after themselves? Have they been able to talk to anybody else about you know, whatever's worrying them. And sometimes you do have to be quite explicit when you're supporting someone over the telephone, because again, you can't see what they are. So you have to really think about, what information do I need to know? I need to know if they're okay. I need to know if they need some support. I need to think about how they're feeling, how they're behaving, how they are health-wise, because they're the main ones that we can help and support them with, or guide them and signpost them to services. And that's, I've come to the end of the presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
I had a question, Frances. I was just wondering if you had any particular advice, maybe with someone who's experiencing a bereavement, but with someone who they didn't have a particularly good relationship with, or maybe had kind of challenges whilst they were alive.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. Again, it goes back to those how that person grieves, so what their relationship was like, and sometimes it's you need to kind of talk to them about kind of thinking what is it that their relationship, what was it about their relationship that was good, because it's always useful to remind them what was good about the relationship, what was bad about that relationship, and sometimes what people, particularly people who've had who don't get on with somebody who's died, sometimes kind of writing down their issues with that person, and then kind of people have done things like kind of burnt it or something to say, you know, you really hurt me, my feelings, when this happened, and you were really angry with me, or you know, we didn't get on and I would have liked to have got on, and then sometimes people kind of burn those then letters, and they can be completely private, and that can give the sense that that's kind of, I've said my piece. Because sometimes with people who found it quite difficult, had a difficult relationship, sometimes it's the fact that they haven't been able to tell that person how they've made them feel when they were alive, and talking through how they felt about that person, or what would they say to them, what made them so angry, and then also exploring how they think that they're going to move on with their life as well. So thinking about, this is what's happened, we can't change the fact that you had this relationship, this difficult relationship, but how are you going to make your kind of the loss of that person, how are you going to come out of that, what do you want to do for the future, and thinking about that, because sometimes they like they get stuck thinking, oh, I never got to say that, and they were really horrible, and this happened and this happened, and often they get kind of stuck in the moment or stuck in the past, and they don't look forward. So sometimes giving them ideas of things that they can do for themselves to move forward can help and support. Often, if somebody's had quite a difficult relationship, a GP would say to talk it through with a counsellor, because they have the knowledge and skills to be able to unpick, you know, exactly the moment that person you know, started to feel not right about that person, and it could be that there's also other issues there that need to be worked through. So it may be going back to that person saying, okay, you're feeling like you're feeling, but maybe you need to speak to somebody about these issues. Do you think that would help? Maybe they wouldn't want to talk to you about it, maybe they want to write it down, but also then suggest, you know, there are professional people that they can talk to who are completely, you know, impartial. And most people who do that tend to go to a counsellor, and they might only go once or twice. and blurt everything out from start to finish. But that's what they needed. That's how what they needed to do. And if you feel that you're not the best person to support, then it's trying to encourage them to maybe talk to their GP about it. The other thing that you can do at the moment is, whereabouts are you? You're in Nantwich, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm in Nantwich.
So what you can do is you can also phone up, if you phone up Churchview and talk to the social prescriber there, Michael Wilcox. Michael Wilcox will then be able to help and support that person to access some counselling through the hospice. And they haven't got waiting lists at the moment because they've been given some money by the NHS to help and support people through bereavement, because people are isolated with COVID-19 basically. So normally you would have to use the hospice services to be able to access that, but they've opened it out to a lot of the communities now. So Michael Wilcox at Churchview will be able to help and support you to get that person some counselling if that's what they would like to do. Otherwise, if it's working through it with that person, sitting and listening to their anxieties about what's gone on, encouraging them to write it down, and then think about what do they want for the future, to try and bring something positive, because most of it will be negative, I would expect. So it's thinking about some of the positives and how they can move forward with that.
Thank you.
Has anybody else got any other questions?
Yes. Hello. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Hi. Only just on the point, when you talk about the different cycles or the different thoughts around grief and how that manifests, and whether it's the waterfall or a bowl of spaghetti or your own personal experiences, etc. It still sounds as if it's like you have one lot of grief and then there's a time lapse and there might be another lot of grief and then there's that. And in reality, sometimes these things happen at the same time. So you could, for example, get divorced, lose your job, and a parent could pass away. And you've not exactly been through one process before another process before another process. Yeah. And it's just some thoughts on, advice around that kind of thing. That's very often the reality of the world, that it's not individual things that happen one at a time. These things can be like all happening at the same time. Before you've sorted one issue out, you're on to the next one, and it's all grief, but for different reasons. So it's I should imagine that's difficult to support and quite complex.
It is quite complex. We've experienced that only a couple of times, because I'm not a trained counsellor, but we have been through and supported people in that kind of situation, particularly where somebody's owned a house, then they've died, and the person's then not got a house to live in, not got any finances, and they've lost the person as well. And what we've done is that we've tried to help them out with things like with practical things. So it's we did a kind of a day-to-day, let's think about what we're going to do on Monday, what we're going to achieve on Monday, just so that you can help them to keep going with the physical everyday things. And then then it's almost like they're saying that they have to work through the emotional side, in peaks and troughs. And when they're having a good morning, for example, it's helping and supporting them to talk through things at that time. And it's quite difficult to work out when somebody is, okay, in themselves, to be able to talk about something. It can be quite difficult. There isn't really an easy answer to that, because they've got to work through each individual piece of loss. But all I can suggest really is that you kind of separate those out and say, you know, anything practical from the emotional. So if you've had a death, try and keep that quite separate, and maybe support practically for the other things, and use your talking and listening skills for the person around that person that they've lost. That's kind of my advice for that, but it is quite a tricky situation, and there's no kind of easy route when you've had more than one loss.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
Sorry about that. And did you have a question, David?
Yes. How do you support somebody who perhaps even 8, 9, 10 years after bereavement insists on remembering their birthday, the day they died, and has a whole series of things that upset them every time it comes up, but don't, you know, can't seem to leave that alone, just keeps coming back to it all the time?
It's really difficult, and because that's kind of the way of their remembering, it's really difficult to say to somebody not to do that, because that's their kind of ritual, as you say. That's how they've really relocated that person, and all you can do is support them in that. So if there's a birthday or Christmas, it's thinking about what can you do on that day to help and support them through that day. Because unfortunately, you know, people will remember, you know, it's their way of remembering things. What you could do is, you could do things like, I don't know if you've done anything like a memory box with the person. And it can be putting various things, some of the memories that they've had in that box, because sometimes it might be that person wants to talk about the loved one a little bit more, but the only time that they feel that they can bring it up and say, I'm missing this person still, is on their birthday or at Christmas. And actually, you know, talking about it, you know, every week, you know, or getting them to talk to that person and tell them what they're doing every day. Sometimes that can really help, because it might be that person hasn't really had the opportunity to really talk about that loved one. You know, sometimes, especially if it's a long time ago, you know, life does go on, and people do forget. But actually, if that person was very close and attached to them, then they will still want to talk about it. Like, it's like I still talk about my mum 5 years. I use her, my poor old mum, I use her as an example every time I'm doing training. But it's my way of then, you know, remembering her, because, and using that experience that I had to say, well, you know, talking about that person every day or every week, or when they feel like talking about it, is a good thing, because that's helping them to keep going, really. Because it is difficult, particularly if that person was very, very close. And that's what it would sound like to me, that was a very, very close person to that person.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Frances, and thanks everybody for those great questions. I mean, your presentation was great, because there's so much information and quite in-depth stuff that you can go into. So thank you for everybody that joined tonight and stayed with us.